Hello, thank you for coming back after that first video. Today I want to show you something a little bit different. This is a Grundig Beat Boy from 1986. It's interesting to me on its own because of the overall look and style of it, which I will show you in a little bit, but the reason I wanted to show you this today is because it touches on some interesting history going all the way back to post-war Germany. Grundig is an interesting company on its own. It started out as just a brick and mortar radio store in 1945. The thing is, Germany's economy at that time was still under very strict rules from the Allies after World War II. What that meant for the people living there at the time was that things like radios were very strictly controlled, specifically the production and manufacturing of them. Before the war, radios were pretty easy to get. That was actually by design. The radio, like the television at the time, was leaned on heavily for the distribution of political propaganda. In order to facilitate this, the Minister of Propaganda requested a radio set be made in mass quantities and at low enough price that the German citizens could afford one. Similar approach to the Volkswagen. The result was the Volksempfänger, or People's Radio, which was designed by an electrical engineer named Otto Griesing. Not surprisingly, they were just single-speaker AM tube radios. And they sold well, despite being very simple, even by the standards of the day. In fact, they became so ubiquitous that 40 years later, Kraftwerk featured one on the cover of their Radioactivity album. Even though the available broadcasts were propaganda-heavy, they still had enough music and other programming that people loved listening to the radio, and it became a common enough practice that they got used to having access to them. So when the war broke out and a lot of broadcasts ceased, that left a vacuum. When World War II ended and Allied powers had control over the broadcast, they wanted to do whatever they could to eliminate nationalistic content. I'm simplifying here, but essentially West German broadcasts were privately owned and East German ones were state-controlled. However, both were bringing new music and programs from Western media. Rather than forcing people not to listen to old nationalist content, they essentially fought it by just offering something more interesting, which turned out to be really effective. So, right after the war, when people were trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy, the radios that were still left suddenly opened a window to all kinds of new media. Unfortunately, for listeners, radio production was still strictly controlled. So how does all that relate back to Grundig? Well, as a response to that demand, Max Grundig began selling radio kits out of his store. The kits included everything but the tubes themselves, so that technically they weren't actual radios and he could legally make and sell them with no restrictions. All people had to do was buy some tubes and hook them in. By 1948, restrictions had lifted enough that Grundig was able to manufacture a fully functional radio, and after only a year, they had sold over 150,000 units. Obviously, they had expanded to a factory facility by this point and had a full manufacturing and development division. Now, in 1949, Grundig released a radio called the Grundig Boy, which was a more or less portable, self-contained radio unit. That was the beginning of the word boy in their naming convention. What followed was a successful electronics company that saw major growth through the 1950s. Within a couple of years, they were producing everything from transistor radios to the big wooden home stereo cabinets. Then, in 1960, a few important things happened. They started manufacturing parts and products outside of Germany, the first facility being in Northern Ireland. They also began making modular hi-fi components that we're familiar with. But the big thing for our story is the release of their line of mini handheld transistor radios, which they called the Mini Boy. The next key moment came in 1972, when Philips, the company that designed the compact cassette back in 1963, began buying up stock in Grundig. The reason that this is significant is because 2 years after the compact cassette hit the market, Grundig released its own proprietary cassette format, the DC International. These were only ever meant to be dictation tapes since both formats ran at 1 7/8 IPS, inches per second. That slow speed reproduced much lower fidelity sound than the reel-to-reel machines used in hi-fi systems, which ran from 3 3/4 up to 30 IPS. However, improvements in fidelity were very quick, and by 1965, the same year that DC International was released, record companies had already begun selling pre-recorded music on compact cassette. That gained momentum quickly enough that by 1967, Grundig relented and began manufacturing its first compact cassette recorder. At the same time that Philips was slowly buying up Grundig in Europe, over in Japan, one of the co-founders of Sony, Masaru Ibuka, had developed a habit of carrying a large bulky tape recorder with him while he traveled so that he could listen to music. Naturally, this was inconvenient and cumbersome and tended to be susceptible to being bumped. Plus, since it was just a dictation machine, the sound wasn't good. The idea for a small portable playback-only cassette player was born out of that habit. If it was worth the effort to lug around a bulky cassette recorder just for music on the train, it stood to reason a small, convenient, nice-sounding personal stereo would be worthwhile. So, in 1979, the very first Walkman was born, the TPS-L2. Though an obvious game-changing idea in retrospect, the unit was only expected to sell 5,000 total units per month when it initially launched in Japan. But it ended up surprising everyone by selling more than 6 times that in the first 2 months. This was at the immodest price of $150. That's over $600 today. It didn't take long for other electronics and stereo companies to take notice, and Grundig was no different. By now, Philips and Grundig were the first and second largest consumer electronics manufacturers in Europe, respectively, and eventually, Philips had come to own so much of Grundig's stock that they actually took over Grundig in 1984. However, even before they had controlled the company, Philips was a majorly influential shareholder in Grundig, and in 1981 they had created their own version of the Walkman, continuing their naming convention by calling it the Beat Boy 100. It looked a lot like the original Sony Walkman, but just silver, and as it turns out, was not actually manufactured by Grundig at all. If what I've learned is correct, Grundig never actually made a personal stereo unit of their own. All the units, including the one I have here, were actually designed and made overseas in Korea, then just given a Grundig label. This was and still is a very common practice with a lot of companies, and in no way necessarily means lower quality. Bit of a long road, but that brings us to this beauty right here. I was really excited to get my hands on this thing. We bought it from an estate sale where the guy had collected a lot of different radios, flip clocks, mini TVs, all kinds of other stuff. Most of it was still in the boxes and had never even been opened or used. I'm pretty sure that's the case with this thing. Let's open the box and look what's inside. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this is the holy grail of personal stereos. It's far from that. According to a lot of the forums I've read, this is a mid-range OEM cassette player and isn't the most reliable unit ever produced. But I kind of feel like that's not really the point anymore. If you own this and you use it today, you're doing it because it's nostalgic. It's fun. Look, it's white, it's pink, everything about it screams 1986. Everything from the little triangle patterns on the inside to the little pink stop button at the top. This is fun. It is a fun thing. At a time when every song ever can be found on Spotify and YouTube, this is an attention-getting, hey, look at me accessory. And even though there are tons of people online that will say it's mediocre, I listened to it, and at least to my untrained ear, this one sounded fine. I'm not an audiophile, and I don't have a great ear or anything, but I would be perfectly happy listening to all my cassettes on this. It has auto reverse. That worked fine. The Dolby noise reduction worked absolutely as expected. If you ask me, this is a great little unit, and it is really cool looking. And that's kind of the whole point. Oh, a couple other things. This unit, the 170, came in two different colors. There was one like this, and then there was a black and red version. The black and red version just has a big stripe across the front, whereas this one says challenge on it. Once again, we managed to find it with all the accessories still in it. There's a belt clip, the headphones, the clip for the headphones, even the lanyard. And it still has the original manual and the warranty card. I noticed something kind of fun with the manual too. On the second page where the English directions are, there's a warning that says not to play it loudly when you're in traffic so that you know if a car is coming. What I thought was kind of funny was that the warning on it is on all the language pages except the German one. And they spelled traffic, fraffic. So yeah, be careful in fraffic. So that's it. That's the Grundig Beat Boy 170. I'll leave you with a couple of nice close-ups of it so you can see it in all the details. Thanks for watching.